Have you ever wanted to be Daenerys Targaryen? Soaring high above a fantasy battlefield atop your dragon mount, and with a simple command, burning them all. Back when the last episodes of Game of Thrones were airing, yeah, this video has been a long time coming, I couldn't help but want to take to the skies myself. Sure, it may not have made Dany the most moral of characters to emulate, but it can make for one hell of a fun video game. Riding a massive winged dragon is sadly a gaming theme that doesn't get the attention that it rightly deserves. The Panzer Dragoon series of games relies on incredible on-rails dragon fighting action with a harrowing story to boot, yet its lack of open gameplay can leave a player not feeling completely in control. The Drakengard franchise also features a dragon that you can mount, but it still doesn't quite scratch that overpowered winged beast destroying armies like twigs itch. Then there was L.A.I.R, an early PS3 title that promised exciting air combat high above epic land battles, and that's just for starters. The game was to feature intuitive motion controls that pledged to put players directly in the saddle of their dragon mount. Its remote play attribute, the first PlayStation game to offer it, allowed players to connect their PSP to their PS3 via the internet and play directly off the handheld. The game was also to push the graphical boundaries of Sony's new console, offering the best visuals to date. To stoke the fires even more, composer John Debney was to make his video game debut, having worked on glorified projects such as The Emperor's New Groove, The Passion of the Christ, and the television series Sequest, DSV. Finally, acclaimed studio Factor 5, famous for their praised Star Wars Rogue Squadron franchise, was to weave this game together, connecting all of these golden strands into a timeless PS3 masterpiece. But you've already read the title. You know that this is trash or treasure. So, what exactly went wrong? Unlike with a lot of titles I cover in this series, L.A.I.R is quite the complicated case. It's a tale of publisher interference, of technology not living up to what was initially pitched, and financial blunders that all but guaranteed the game to be a flop. It all began with exclusivity. After releasing their massively successful Rogue Squadron trilogy spanning across the Nintendo 64 to the GameCube, Factor 5 began to butt heads with the publisher of the Star Wars games, LucasArts. Leadership at LucasArts was shuffling in 2003, and the publisher became extremely hesitant to license their franchises off. Case in point, in 2003 when Factor 5 released Rebel Strike, LucasArts had published 9 total games that year. The very next year, after new president Jim Ward took over, only 4 titles were released. That's a massive decline. Ward's 4-year tenure with LucasArts spelled the beginning of the end for the studio, but that's a story for another time. Meanwhile, Factor 5 pitched 2 original ideas to multiple publishers. Animal Wars, a turn-based tactical game inspired by George Orwell's Animal Farm, and Dragon Knight, the game that would later come to be known as L.A.I.R. Sony bit on the projects and offered to publish the titles under the condition that they remain exclusive to the PlayStation brand. Factor 5 agreed. Being paired up with one of the industry's big 3 seemed to be a match made in heaven. By and large, though, Sony would have a direct hand in L.A.I.R's failure. Initially, L.A.I.R was to be a game about 2 warring religious factions, and the player assuming the role of a mercenary who takes jobs for the 2 groups. It would be open world, with the player using their dragon to explore the land and take quests at their own pace. Lead designer Julian Egbrecht states that the game was inspired by the real-life Middle Eastern wars that occurred after 9/11, and he wanted the game to have depth, relatability, and really say something on that. Sony disagreed. The topic was just too controversial for the Japanese studio to sign off on. They required a more traditional story, featuring a true hero's journey. They also insisted that Factor 5 focus on a more linear title, just as they had done with their previous Rogue Squadron games. Eggebrecht reflects that it was at this point that he lost most interest in even developing the game, but nevertheless, Factor 5 went back to the drawing board, and by year's end, the key concept of the plot was conceived. In the released version, the story of L.A.I.R takes place in a world ravaged by erupting volcanoes, whose deadly lava streams have scarred the land, ridding it of its resources, and heavy ash has blotted out much of the sky. There are a few areas left in the world that feature green plains and plant life, and one of those is the noble kingdom of SCEA. As Roan, a member of the dragon-riding Assylian Sky Guards, the player is tasked with defending the kingdom from the invading Mokai, described as a blasphemous, sinful tribe that wishes only to rid SCEA of its god-gifted green bounty. The religious themes are still there, but never quite reached the depth that Eggebrecht originally wanted. However, I will say that it does a good job of exploring religious conflict. Now, I don't normally discuss spoilers here, but I'm going to break tradition and explain just what makes this so intriguing. In the beginning, the protagonist Roan has a deep hatred for the Mokai. He's been raised to believe them as a godless people, punished for their lack of convictions, and thinking that their attacks are solely based on their evil intentions. By the midway point in the campaign, however, Roan has discovered that the Church of SCEA isn't quite as it seems. The Church has held secrets from its people and covered up their own sinful deeds. Roan realizes that the Mokai were once just as prosperous, but were robbed by the Assylians long ago, and have only attacked the kingdom out of desperation for food and supplies. Had they not gone to war with SCEA, the Mokai would most certainly have perished in the turbulent, lava-filled world that the Assylians have had a hand in creating. There's a lot to relate to the real world here. Most everyone has been challenged in their faith, have struggled to come to terms with the sins of their past, be it personally done or perhaps a heinous deed performed by one's ancestors. It's a shame that the developers weren't able to explore this more meaningfully, as I think that it really would have separated it from the other fantasy-themed war games. Just as work began on the early prototype for L.A.I.R, it became apparent that the game would be better suited for the quickly approaching PlayStation 3 console. The original work was scrapped, along with the engine and designer tools Factor 5 had created for designing their previous games, and new tools were created from scratch. This may have been the single biggest mistake in L.A.I.R's development, admits Eggebrecht. Not only did we have this completely new system to learn, he said, but we also had no base technology. It was a costly blunder, not only financially, but in time as well. Ultimately, it would contribute to the game being delayed a full year past the PlayStation 3 launch. Perhaps the biggest issue that affected reviews and sales for the game, however, were in the controls. L.A.I.R was advertised as having been built to exclusively use the PS3 6-axis motion controls. Sony was heavily pushing this feature because of the hype behind the Nintendo Wii, and they believed that the motion controls built into the PS3 controller were just as good, if not better, than the Wii's. They were wrong. The player controls their dragon's flight by tilting the controller either up or down to set the height, and tilting left or right to bank in that direction. The idea was to simulate a kind of range like on a horse, but in this case on a dragon. It's a concept that's cool in theory, but awful when you actually attempt it. Eggebrecht states that motion controls were never part of the initial discussion for L.A.I.R. It was forced upon them when the team behind the remake of Warhawk were put off by them. Against their own lack of enthusiasm, Eggebrecht states that Sony put a ton of pressure on us and said, "You have to be the showcase motion control title. You'll figure out how it works." According to Eggebrecht, they couldn't get it to work, and they knew that this would be a huge mark against the title. the 6-axis controller just wasn't responsive enough to hold an entire AAA gaming experience on its shoulders. The 6-axis was finicky in that it often recognized small movements, which required the gamer to hold their controller very steadily, or else their dragon would be all over the place. Often, the character would do the exact opposite of what the player wanted because of its tendency to misrecognize gestures. When testing this out, I personally couldn't complete the tutorial level before getting so frustrated I needed to take a break. This is a game that requires standard analog controls. Eggbrick claims that they were willing to release a day one patch for analog controls for the game, but Sony refused. As reviews were coming out that lambasted the experience, Sony decided not to patch it and admit that there was a problem, but instead attempt to reteach gaming journalists how to play the game the right way. In a bizarre move, Sony mailed out a 21-page full-color reviewer's guide with sections that further explain the story, the features, and of course the controls. This was after the reviews were already published, mind you, and did little to nothing to right the off-course ship. Level designer Mark Wilhelm describes the experience as embarrassing. It's like when your weird uncle shows up to your graduation party. We were so cringing about the reviewer's guide, he said. In April of 2008, 7 months after release, a patch did come, containing analog controls and a host of extra content. This was the version that if you booted up the game on PS3 today, you'll get to play. It's really a totally different experience. Now imagine using the buttons on a controller to actually, control the game. It's genius. Piloting your dragon becomes as easy as flying an X-Wing, or an F-14 Tomcat, or any other aerial vehicle in gaming. Now it's not perfect, but damn it, at least it works. Now, there are still some motion controls left in the game. At times, you may have to slam the controller to the side to bash into nearby enemy flyers, or shake it violently to release a foe that's got you in their grip. Also, to perform more complex maneuvers such as making a 180-degree turn, you still have to move the controller. Unfortunately, these become intrusive. Even in these simple instances, the 6-axis is still too unreliable to register all of these movements unless they're performed in a very specific way. Couple that with having to keep your hand on the joystick while you're thrashing about, and you can very easily steer your winged beast straight into the ground or cliffside if you aren't careful. Well, actually, I slightly took a fib just now. You don't have to use the motion controls to do a 180 or a barrel roll, but even after the patch, the game's tutorial tells you that you do. However, they did map these maneuvers to the left and right directional buttons. This makes things so much easier, but no player would know this unless they accidentally figured it out on their own. Even checking the controls in the options menu doesn't state that this is possible. I didn't learn it until I was almost finished with the game. It's oversights like this that plague this whole experience. Air combat is very straightforward. Pressing the square button will unleash a powerful slow-moving fireball, which takes a second or so to recharge after using. You can hit the square button rapidly to spit smaller, faster balls of flame, but these are far weaker and rarely useful. The circle button will make your dragon perform a dashing melee attack that can knock damaged foes right out of the sky. If they don't die, it will initiate a close-range battle where two dragons square off. You'll have to dodge and block attacks from the enemy while landing your own, making for a visually exciting battle, if a bit on the easy side. That's all there is to it, really. The lack of special abilities is extremely noticeable here. Not all of the action in L.A.I.R takes place in the air, however. Your dragon mount can land and wreak havoc on the ground forces as well. There's a sick sense of joy mowing down all these defenseless soldiers, either with a tail whip, a stream of flame, or grasping them in your razor-sharp teeth. There's rarely much challenge in ground warfare, though, and the instances when it is necessary are brief. There are a couple of enemy units that require it, but for the most part, everything you fight is the same, and dispensed of in the same manner. The 2008 patch also added an option to turn on crosshairs, something that the original game oddly didn't include. The lock-on system is virtually a necessity to complete the release build, as it's extremely difficult to tell where your fire blasts are going in the air. What makes matters worse is that the lock-on isn't precise either, just like the controls. Often, the computer will choose an opponent that's nowhere near what you think you're targeting, causing Roan to look like an absolute idiot in battle. With the crosshairs, it becomes a little more bearable. The lock-on is still a requirement, I think, to ruling the skies. I used it so often mainly because it's so hard to tell friend from foe when piloting through the air. The dragons all look the same to me, unless I'm right on top of them, unlike TIE fighters, which have that distinct roar when they're flying past. All dragons just sound like dragons, and I just can't differentiate between good guy and bad guy. In a release version, there is only one dragon available at the start of the game to choose from, and another, slightly more powerful dragon is unlocked around the midway point. That's it. The 2008 patch adds 2 new dragon types to use at any time. The Poison Dragon is a large, slow powerhouse, while the Wind Dragon is a small, fast, and fragile Skyrunner. It's good to have these options, but in the end, I never felt that the dragons played any differently aside from their speed and health. Additional attacks now, that would have gone a long way in mixing things up. As mentioned before, L.A.I.R was the very first game to make use of the PSP connectivity with the PS3, allowing players to stream the game from their home console to their handheld in its entirety. Well, kind of. This was another feature pushed on Factor 5 by Sony, and just wasn't thought out well. The feature was removed just prior to release because the PSP didn't have motion controls, something else that Sony forced on the development team. Later, when the feature was implemented and allowed the use of the PSP analog stick, it still wasn't fully playable because the handheld lacked L2 and R2 buttons, as well as a right stick, all necessary to perform certain actions and complete the game. It would be several months before this too was patched, with an update that substituted other buttons when played in handheld mode. It's just incredible at the amount of oversight on display here. The graphical prowess of the game was a major selling point prior to the game's release, and while still good, L.A.I.R comes up short in this area as well. The developers later admitted that they overestimated the power of the PS3, believing it could produce movie-quality graphics at a steady frame rate. The end product still looks nice, with a great level of detail on the environments and on the dragons, and that Factor 5 signature push to achieve realism is there, but frequent slowdown during big explosions or in heavy combat really softens the visual appeal of the title, at times bringing the game to a stuttering crawl. The heavy use of browns and grays doesn't help either. It doesn't stand out from the pack, as it seems the vast majority of graphic-heavy games in the late 2000s had access to the same stale color palette. One area where the game far exceeds expectations is the music. John Debney does a superb job of crafting an epic score full of the excitement fitting for a war of dragons. It reminds me strongly of John Williams' work on The Phantom Menace and Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings, with a good dash of World War II epics for good measure. Debney makes full use of a 90-piece orchestra to craft some outstanding battle themes that transport the player from their couch into the fiery war zone of the screen. This is a soundtrack that I would happily listen to on its own, and frankly, if you have no interest in the game, I recommend finding the soundtrack online and giving it a thorough chance. It's an audible treat to your ears, and you won't regret it. In the end, the failure of L.A.I.R led to Sony canceling their deal with Factor 5. Animal War would be an idea lost to time. Factor 5 would pitch ideas to Nintendo, such as a Pilot Wings spin-off and a Kid Icarus game, but nothing came of that either. Later, they would enter work on a game based on a proposed sequel to Bryan Singer's 2006 film Superman Returns, but that too, just like the movie, never left the ground. Numerous legal disputes and lawsuits later saw the closing of Factor 5 in May of 2009. L.A.I.R would be their last game. I believe that the 2008 patch does wonders to update the game and make it easily playable from start to finish. It doesn't correct all the issues with it, however. The game certainly doesn't live up to the hype it had prior to release, nor does it come close to fulfilling the vast realm of possibilities it has. What it does offer, more than a decade after release, is an enjoyable 10-hour campaign of flying a dragon to blast other dragons out of the sky. And that's really all we wanted in 2007 when it first came out. If you've avoided this one since release, fearful of taking to the skies because of those god-awful controls, let this review put your mind at ease. You might not find a trove of gold hoarded by a dragon, but you may walk away with a shiny coin to go along with your tale of adventure. Anyway, here's Wonderwall.